All right, we're going to film this in 4K. So, guys, it's Jay here, back for another educational video. If you haven't watched the previous two videos, you're probably not going to understand this video as much, so you might want to have to go and spend 9 minutes on those other videos. All right, so we still haven't made a case for Dan. Well, to many of you, I probably have, but this is not sufficient enough. We need to get into his development. We need to get into his core neurosis. Well, we're not going to get into his core neurosis because, well, that'd be unethical. And frankly, I just want to give a disclaimer. I like Dan. I think Dan is a good person. This is not a video meant to smear him or whatever like this. This is simply just a case study. Same thing he would do for me. Okay. All right, so just to fill you guys in a bit more, we began noticing the shift around 2023 when he would spend long stretches of time away from home sitting in his car, saying he was working on something. That work later turned out to be the theory he had been developing privately. At the time, I was concerned about his withdrawal from home life and his broader social disengagement. I was also concerned that he might be becoming depressed. In my time observing him within a neutral server, I noticed a recurring pattern in debate. His explanations were often vague, but delivered with technical jargon, and he repeatedly redirected discussion back to his own model as the authoritative frame. He would frequently declare himself as the victor of these exchanges prematurely, which had the effect of closing off or discouraging further discourse. Those who challenged his perceived authority were often characterized as exhausting. He has explicitly positioned himself as an authority and at times referred to himself as the final word. And this posture has extended beyond typologies into areas such as Enneagram. He appears to have taken on the role of correcting others' interpretations when it is advantageous to do so, particularly when it reinforces the legitimacy of his own model and his own conclusions. To be fair, some degree of this behavior is not unusual within niche theoretical communities. This is often an element of positioning and self-promotion when developing and presenting a model. I've even done the same thing, maybe not to this degree, but my concern is not that Dan advocates for his ideas, but that he appears to treat his assumptions as exempt from the kind of friction testing required to refine them. That process is essential. The weak points in any model are rarely visible from within it. They are typically exposed through sustained contact with differing perspectives, where assumptions are challenged, clarified, and when necessary, revised. Without that process, a system risks stabilizing around its own untested premises rather than converging on something more robust or accurate. This is what we all need to do. This is not singling out Dan. This is advice to myself, to others. Let's get back to Dan. Given Dan's age, being in his 40s, arriving at a clean developmental conclusion is more challenging. My suspicion is that Dan was operating in a Trinity configuration prior to 2024, and that the system began to destabilize when excessive precision or gain was granted to his priors. At that point, his identity appears to have become increasingly entangled with the universal structure described earlier. There is a known risk in this orientation. When attention becomes too narrowly focused, one can begin to experience the perception of a timeless geometry underlying all phenomena. As NI continues to present patterns as cyclical and reoccurring, the form begins to feel universal, regardless of time or circumstance. The issue is that individuals can spend years constructing internally consistent models only to drift away from the conditions that would allow those models to gain traction, which is sustained external validation and critique. In a balanced system, SE would serve this corrective role. In Dan's case, it appears to be struggling to regulate the positive feedback, or what I have described as excessive precision giving to priors, within the TI-NI loop. Dan displays a reduced capacity to maintain continuous contact with reality, while the internal system continues to accelerate. At the same time, he appears to be becoming increasingly aware of the burden associated with FE. However, rather than turning toward it, he treats it as something to evade or contend with. What seems to be happening with Dan requires a distinction between a trinity that is saturated, one that has bifurcated, and one that has degenerated. Trinity saturation is comparatively easier to identify. It occurs when tension within the system accumulates to a critical point while the structure remains intact. The gateway is still functioning, though under strain, and previously excluded material begins to press upward. At this stage, reorganization becomes possible but has not yet occurred. The material is felt but not yet understood. Bifurcation, however, is something different. In this case, the pressure becomes sufficient to force a reorganization. The gateway no longer holds the prior structure together, and the system begins to reconstitute itself on a new basis. What was once excluded no longer appears as foreign, but begins to be recognized as part of the self. Degeneration also involves gateway collapse. Here the same pressure is present, but instead of opening, the system contracts around itself. Rather than allowing the unfamiliar to enter, it reinforces what is already known. Precision is increasingly given to priors, while incoming variance is reinterpreted or absorbed without effect. The system attempts to stabilize itself by amplifying its own activity. It does not break down all at once. It becomes increasingly self-confirming and resistant to correction. In other words, bifurcation requires contact, degeneration avoids it. At present, Dan's case appears more consistent with degeneration than with bifurcation. This remains a provisional assessment, but it aligns with the earlier observations of gateway collapse, persistent allocation of precision to priors, and a diminishing role of corrective feedback. From this state, there are generally two possible trajectories. I always like to provide a prescription because I know people in this community go, okay, fine, so what do I do, right? The first is re-regulation. The system reestablishes some degree of internal balance. The gateway function recovers, and the individual returns to a more stable trinity configuration. A return to regulation remains possible if sufficient contact with constraint is reestablished. There is a concern with this, though, because you could have a collapse of the persona that occurs with degeneration, and you could have a negative restoration of that persona within a trinity, a re-regulated trinity configuration, and it could be negative and it could end up in a state of degeneration once again. So that's something to be looking out for, Dan. The second possibility is progression into bifurcation. This is the possibility that you want. However, this only occurs through saturation, not degeneration. Saturation implies that the upper structure begins to approximate what lies beneath it. In doing so, it becomes increasingly sensitive to the variance of the inferior function. What was previously experienced as external or threatening begins to be recognized as part of the self. This recognition is what enables reorganization rather than collapse. And so, time will tell how this pans out for Dan, but that would be my advice. So my diagnosis is that Dan is a TISE. He has a degenerated trinity. He is giving excessive precision or gain to priors, which means that he's hyperfixated on NI, and he's not having enough continuous contact with reality. In other words, stripping away the dreamlike mythological aspects and instead giving more precision to evidence, which would be found in the zone, which is the TISE configuration within the Trinity. Yeah, guys, that's it. This was quite long. I hope you got something out of it. I understand that this stuff seems jargony and whatever. It requires quite a bit of a background in purest Jungian vocabulary to really grasp it. And this is something that you'll arrive at if you read the correct literature and get in the right groups. With that, I'll leave a link. You know where to find me if you have more questions about this. If you think it's just bullshit, well, that's also understandable too. People often think what they don't understand is bullshit, and most of you are definitely not going to understand this. So, like I said, you know where to find me. If you find this interesting, you'll probably be interesting.